You know, if you can afford to retire, I definitely recommend it. Especially if you can afford to retire before you're 40. All I do is sit around the little fire on my front porch. I wish you could see it. It's not such a little front porch. I think the front porch might be bigger than my whole house. Anyway, I'm rambling. All I do is sit on my front porch around the little gas fire that my dad left for me. And sometimes, if you can get me out of my hammock, I tell great stories to those who wander in. Speaking of, welcome to Cozy Horror. With me, Dr. Plague. I've got 5 great stories for you by yours truly today, and I really think you're gonna like them. Today's Cozy Horror theme is dogs. Man's best friend. Our little furry protectors. Well, sometimes they are. Sometimes they aren't. We'll see how our 4-legged friends in these stories help keep the boogans away. We'll start with one of my favorites. A dog that's there to protect. A dog that's there to keep the peace. A dog that maybe comes from somewhere a little beyond what we're used to. So, when you see the signs, remember, beware of dog. It should have been an easy score. Rob an old man, leave without much fuss. We never could have guessed how south it would go. Everyone had heard of Duncan Adams. He'd been a fixture in the community for generations, living in that wild old house up on Mount Yaller. He'd been a writer, a professor of antiquities at Georgia State College, and any number of other things. His house was supposed to contain all sorts of expensive things, and we were going to see if the rumors were true. Mike didn't like it, though. Guy like that is certain to have all sorts of security, the best measures money can buy, and you just expect the 4 of us to walk in like it's nothing. Julius, Gavin, Mike, and I like to call ourselves a crew, but that was just from watching too many heist movies. In reality, we were just 4 guys who like to break into people's houses and steal things. We weren't druggies, we weren't criminals, despite what our records said. But we did like to buy nice things, and stealing often paid for them better than a real job. You'd think so, I said, but my brother went up there to do a job and said that there were no security systems, no cameras, no nothing. The dude is just asking to get robbed, and I say we take him up on it. My youngest brother's a plumber, and that was actually where I got the idea for the job. He got called about a month ago to fix some pipes in the old man's bathroom, and came back to tell us how cool the place was. He had all these mirrors on the grounds, and in the house, and on the walls, and it was like a fun house. It was really cool looking, he said. The old man had paid him a mint to do the job, and I'd spent the next 3 weeks thinking about that house, and planning the biggest heist that I could imagine. The plan is that we go in just after dark and jump the sidewall. We can go in through the garden out back, and come out on the back porch and into the house. The old man's a hard sleeper. My brother said he had to ring the bell a dozen times before he woke up. We can go in and out before he even knows we're there, and live like fat rats off the spoils. Mike still wasn't sure, but greed was slowly eroding his sense of self-preservation. He said he would bring it to a vote with the rest of the crew, and later that afternoon he called to say that the vote had been carried unanimously. The other 2 were in, and Mike wasn't about to hold us up with some tickling feeling of doubt. Hope your intel's right, because if you're not, we're all going to be royally screwed. And that was how we came to be hunkered in the scrub around the Duncan Adams estate, waiting for it to get good and dark. We were all dressed in dark clothes, Jules and Gavin wearing ski masks, while Mike and I just had our hoods pulled up. I was pretty sure that we wouldn't need cover, but Jules had 2 prior arrests, and Gavin was clean for the moment. Both wanted to stay out of prison, if they could help it, and had opted to cover their faces. As the dark began to settle around us, We kept to the fence and prepared to vault over. It was just a simple concrete wall, no lights or cameras on the top. But Mike stopped before making a stirrup with his hands to point at a sign on the wall. You didn't say nothing about a dog. I looked at the sign, wrinkled my brow as I tried to remember if Lewis had mentioned a dog. He hadn't. He'd said nothing about any kind of animals on the property, but a dog could complicate things. The sign was the usual black and yellow one that bore the legend, "Beware of dog," on it, but it looked a little faded, and I suddenly wondered if it was something from a while ago. It's probably old. Lewis didn't say anything about a dog or a cat or anything to do with animals. Mike seemed unsure, but I doubled down. Tell you what, I'll go first and drop behind the gate. If there's a dog, it'll just tear me up, and I'll find some way to get out, or you guys can run. We'll only be out for the gas it took to get us here, and I'll have spent a night in jail, worst case scenario. Mike still looked unsure, but he made a stirrup with his hands, and I vaulted over the wall and landed in a well-kept backyard. It had been landscaped to look oriental, maybe Japanese or something, and there was a bridge over a little creek and a well-cared-for walkway that led to the back of the house. There was a sand pit with rocks in it, some trees cut to resemble bonsai trees, and several large reflective columns interspaced around. It was definitely different, but I liked it the longer I stood waiting to get mauled by a Rottweiler or a pit bull. "What do you see?" Mike whispered, as I scanned the area for a slobbering beast that was just waiting to strike. "Nothing. Well, not nothing, but no dog. Come on over. I think it's safe." They dropped over one at a time, Mike reaching back to pull Gavin over before landing himself. They all stared at the strange little garden, so alien in the twilight, and when no lights came on to mark them, and no dog came out to chase us away, we all sighed collectively. "Looks like there wasn't a dog after all," Julia said. "Or he's inside," Mike said skeptically. "Whatever. Cross that bridge when we come to it. We gotta get inside first," I reminded them, as we set off across the little garden path. It was a little eerie to walk across the shadowy garden with only the moon to guide us. The place seemed to be made of strange angles, and the reflective monoliths didn't help matters much. They were everywhere, a new one jutting up every 7 or 8 feet, and they played strange games in the moonlight. I would catch myself looking at them out of the corner of my eye, and more than once I had to turn and make sure something wasn't following us. The reflections created strange shadows, and I was sure I saw something dart out of sight before turning to find nothing and nowhere that it could have gone. "These things are weird," Julia said, keeping his voice pitched low. "I could swear I keep seeing something in them, but it's gone when I look." "Me too," Gavin said, sounding a little unnerved. "Eyes on the prize, boys," I reminded them, but I didn't sound as sure as I tried to convey. The backyard hadn't looked very big, but as we moved towards the house, it seemed to go on forever. We were staying low, trying not to draw attention to ourselves, but it seemed like we should have been there by now. Whenever I looked at the back porch, it always seemed to be about 50 feet away, and every step seemed to bring us no closer. "What the hell was that?" Gavin asked, and his voice was too high. Julia shushed him, whispering back, "What are you talking about?" "There it was again, right there, I saw it," Gavin said, pointing at one of the polished monoliths. I glanced at it, but it was just a flat reflection of the weird trees sitting on the back wall. "There's nothing there, Gav. Get it together, man. In a few hours we'll be leaving with more loot than we can carry. Then you can freak out if you still want to." Gavin looked unsure, but he nodded and kept pace as we made our way through the collection of old trees and topiaries. He wasn't the only one getting a little nervous, though. I could see something in those reflections, too. Something I was beginning to think might be our dog. It was big. Way too big to go vanishing like it always seemed to. It was a mastiff or a wolf hybrid or something, and the longer we trekked through the garden, the closer it seemed to get to us. At first it was just curiously observing us, seeing what we were doing and enjoying its little game of startling us. As we neared the house, though, the game changed. Now it was getting closer to our group, weaving between the statues and plants, getting bigger as it stalked us. I still wasn't sure how it was doing that. The thing had to be nearly 5 feet tall on all fours, but it would disappear any time I turned to look behind me. I wondered if there was some sort of electrical gadget in these things, maybe a display mount to scare intruders, but when I looked right at the polished mirror front, I saw nothing but my own reflection and the larger-than-usual bonsai topiary behind me. I'd like to tell you that we made it to the house before things went sideways, but that's not true. Truth was, we never even saw the inside of the house. We came within about 10 feet of the back porch, a trip that seemed to take longer than it should have when the purpose of the monoliths became apparent. We were hunched around some of the oddities of the garden, trying to get our nerve up before heading in. Gavin and I weren't the only ones that had been seeing things out of the corner of our eyes, and nerves were high as the goal came into view. Now the real work would begin, but we weren't sure what to expect from this funhouse garden. Would we be allowed to make it to the house? Would we be mowed down by some huge hound on our way to the porch? I didn't know, but suddenly this didn't seem like the easy score I had promised them. "Jules," I whispered, "go see if the back door is unlocked." "Why have I got to do it?" Jules asked, his nerves jangling a little. "'Cause you're the closest to the door. Just get up there and see." Jules looked at the house like it was the absolute last place he wanted to go, but greed still had its teeth in him. We could still make something of this, still come out okay, and he scampered up the porch steps with all the stealth he could muster. The doors were glass, fronting on a huge glassed-in kitchen, and when Jules reached out for the handle, he seemed as shocked as we were when it pulled down easily. Damn, guy's not even... But as he took his eyes off the glass, I saw something loom up behind him, something that made me tremble. It was the dog, a huge black hellhound with a gaping maw full of sharp teeth and piercing red eyes. It was behind the glass, and I thought for sure that it would jump through and bury Jules with its bulk. I started to yell, started to warn him, but when it leaned out of the glass and snapped its teeth around him, I was surprised by the lack of a crash. Jules looked surprised too, his shock absolute, and when the creature yanked him into the glass and out of sight, we were left in stunned silence with only the crickets for company. "What the hell was that?" Gavin said, his voice trembling audibly. "I don't know," Mike said, his voice inches behind me as he inched away with every breath, "but I'm not sticking around to find out." He was off and running then, tearing back towards the wall we'd come over. He looked scared enough to jump it without any help, and when I called for him to stop, I winced as a light came on in the house. Great, we'd woken up the old man. Gavin saw the light and took a few steps back himself, but when Mike screamed suddenly, Gavin and I froze as we turned back to see what had happened. In the fleeting rays of the porch light, I saw Mike caught beneath the massive paws. It was coming from the surface of a polished square, and as the head emerged, the beast looked as big as a grizzly bear. The fur was wiry and stiff, something I believe they called brindled in the dog world, and its muzzle was already dripping with blood. It bent down over Mike, the poor guy screaming and thrashing as much as his smushed lungs would allow, and when it covered his head with its mouth, the crying and yelling was cut off abruptly. It took Mike's head with it, but was nice enough to leave the body behind as it disappeared into the polished surface of the brooding rectangle. Gavin and I just stood there for a minute, unsure of what to do. When the door to the back porch opened, we Both got low as we tried to hide from whoever had come to check on the ruckus. "Who's there?" said a voice that had probably once been a little more impressive. Age had done it no favors, and now it was a little less impressive, a little less commanding, but the owner seemed to know that he wasn't the most dangerous creature in the garden. The sound of a cane thumping on the boards could be heard, and when he saw the body, he croaked out a rough laugh. "Decided to come and steal from an old man, huh? You didn't think you were the first, did you?" I looked at Gavin as we hid, trying to tell him to be still, though he seemed to be losing that particular fight. "More than a few people have thought that they could come and plunder what I've rightfully taken in my prime. They see an old man living alone and think to make his home their find of the century. They never guess that the most dangerous thing here might be my own biggest find." As we watched, the old man put out a hand, and the hellish beast stuck its nose out of the window it had sucked jewels into, so the old man could scratch it like any other dog. "I was excavating a tomb in Russia when I found them. These strange black monoliths were just in a cave towards the back of the old tomb. I had never seen anything like them or the beast they held, but it had enough intelligence to understand me when I made it an offer. It didn't seem to be enough that he was going to kill us. The old codger meant to monologue before his hell beast devoured us. 'Come back to my home,' I said. 'Come into the lighted world again, and I will take you from this place and let you hunt my enemies for me.' And so I have. It has hunted a long time on would-be thieves and robbers, and eaten well in the process. You will be no different." Gavin looked at the back wall, a path that would take him over the unmoving corpse of Mike, and seemed to be trying to decide if it was worth the risk. I shook my head at him, trying to tell him not to, but when he suddenly sprinted across the lawn, I found myself right behind him. I could no more stop myself from fleeing in my terror than he could, and we dodged around the monoliths at every opportunity. The hound lunged at us nonetheless, coming out of either side as it tried to stop us. We were neck and neck, nearly to the wall, when Gavin suddenly tripped. I looked back and found that Gavin's foot was stuck in a trap too devilish to escape. The creature had him by the ankle, and as it dragged him backwards, I sprinted for the wall and leapt at the top. My fingers burned as they tried to dig into the concrete, and I'm not ashamed to say that I left a few fingernails behind as I scrambled over the top. I drove home, expecting that the creature or the police would come after me every mile of the way. When it didn't come lunging out of my rearview mirror and no blue and whites dogged my heels, I breathed a sigh of relief. I drove home, locked all the doors in my trailer, and went to my room so I could write this down while it's still fresh. Now that I have, I'm not sure what to do. Do I call the police? What would I even tell them? Can that thing get me through my own mirror, my computer monitor, the surface of my spoons? I don't know what to do, but I do know one thing. If you ever hear of Duncan Adams and his strange house in the mountains and think that an old man living alone will be an easy score, think again. The dog that he has can't be bribed with treats and pets, and all you'll have from that place is death for you and anyone who comes along with you. Whew. It's a little warm out for a fire, but it just really sets the mood, you know? I'm sure that when the cold weather blows in, it'll be a real asset, and I'll be real glad I've got something to drive up my propane bill and to keep my toes from freezing off. In Florida, yeah, probably not a problem, but better safe than sorry. Speaking of the cold weather months, our next story is about a dog and his owner out for a walk. when they encounter something a little odd, a little abnormal. So let's hear about their encounter with snow bunnies. Washington State is a spot known for its snowy vistas and picturesque scenery this time of year, and my husky Max and I love it. The snow was part of the reason I moved here after doing my 8 years in the military, not wanting to see sand or feel heat for the rest of my natural life. I thought strongly about Alaska, but I wasn't in love with the price of supplies or the cost of living. So I moved here last February and got to enjoy a couple of months of snow before spring came in like a lion. The spring and summer were pretty mild that year, but I was eager to see the snow make a return appearance. By August, I was making preparations, winterizing my house, making sure I had ample firewood, and laying by supplies in case Max and I got snowed in. You know, the whole 9 yards. So when I woke up one morning to snow pattering down on the front yard, I was excited. Max and I like to take walks, usually in the evening after my shift at the pop-up storage where I work security, and today Max was extra excited about the prospect of playing in the snow. He was waiting for me by the door when I got home, leash in his mouth and brushy tail wagging as he looked at me expectantly. The look made it very clear that he'd waited patiently all day to go for his walk, and he was ready to go blundering through the snow like the oversized puppy that he was. He had to wait for me to get out of my uniform and put on some walking clothes, but he bore it well. Soon we were traipsing through the winter wonderland, and Max was loving every minute of it. We stayed on leash until we got to a spot near the woods where I'd taken him before. It was a big open field that no one owned, at least to my knowledge, and when I let him off the leash, he was all smiles as he barreled into the snow. I'd brought a tennis ball with me, but after a few throws, he seemed more interested in something in the woods. I, too, had seen slight movement from the wood line, and as I watched him sniff around, something told me to clip his lead back on. Max was a good boy, but he was still prone to chasing. It wasn't too big a problem out here, but if he went blundering aimlessly through the snow, he could get hurt. I had taken the end of the leash, calling his name as I prepared to hook him up, when suddenly a perfectly white rabbit came bursting from the snowdrift. It was gorgeous. Its fur, the almost white of no color. There were some flecks on it, but I began to suspect that they might be dirt that had stuck to it. I was enchanted by the creature for half a second, but that was half a second too long for Max. He barked and ran at it, the rabbit taking off into the woods as Max ran off behind it. I took off too, cursing all the way as my feet crunched in the snow. I should have been faster to leash him. I should have known that he would chase when I saw the rabbit. But my hesitation at the sight of it had cost me. Max's footprints were pretty easy to find. A blind man could have trailed my dog pretty easily, and as I went deeper into the woods, I could hear him barking as he kept chasing that damn rabbit. I kept calling his name, hoping that he would come back, but the deeper I went, the more I thought I'd lost him. It took me some time. My adrenaline was running high, and I was worried about my dog, but as the sun started getting low and the woods started getting less visible, I began to feel something on the back of my neck. Not the snow. I had been feeling that for a while, but it was a feeling that something was watching me. As the sun sank lower and lower in the sky, I could see something big moving in the trees, just behind or to the side of me. I thought wolves at first, but I hadn't seen any report of wolves in the area. I knew there were bears, but they didn't usually bother people, and they were hibernating once the snow fell, weren't they? Whatever this was, it was bigger than any bear I'd ever heard of. I wondered if it might be a moose. They came down from Canada sometimes, but I couldn't think why a moose would be stalking me through the woods. Whatever it was solid white and making no effort to hide itself. It was like a moving snowbank, and whenever it saw me looking at it, the creature seemed to blend in with the white surroundings, making me second guess whether I'd actually seen it or not. I knew I had. I knew what I'd seen, but looking back to see nothing but all that white made me feel like I couldn't trust myself. I felt hunted, and that brought my survival instinct to the surface. A lot of my friends had come back from the war with PTSD or nervous conditions, but I'd been lucky in that respect. Instead, I'd developed a kind of sixth sense when it came to danger, and it put me in a state of heightened awareness. It had served me well in my time overseas, and now I felt myself slip into it, as whatever had my scent was stalking me. I kept calling Max, whistling and shaking his leash, but I was also being careful to listen for the sound of pursuit. A broken branch, a crunch of snow, the fall of powder as something brushed a tree. I was listening for them all, and the deeper I went, the more I heard it. Whatever was following me was not being particularly stealthy, and I got the feeling that it wasn't used to being challenged out here. I put a hand to my waist where I had a small hunting knife strapped to my belt, and I was very happy I'd remembered it. It wouldn't do much against something that big, but it would give me some semblance of a fighting chance. I stopped often, listening for Max even as I listened for my mysterious pursuer. Every 10th step I would stop and listen, call my dog, and proceed again. The crunching of snow remained a constant, but it seemed that whatever it was had decided to keep its distance. I didn't know why. It could easily have taken me at a run and buried me under its weight, but it was being cautious, and that gave me some hope. If it was unsure about me, then maybe I could scare it away with one of the usual tricks. I was trying to remember what the best way was to scare a bear away, and landed on making yourself big before I remembered that was black bears. Black bears were native to the area, but couldn't see one of them following me this far. If it was a grizzly bear, then I was probably already in real danger. The method of avoiding brown bears was to play dead, but if it was hungry enough, I doubted even that would work. If it was a curious moose, then God only knew what I was going to do. I didn't want to think about something like a mountain lion or a cougar. I knew they had big cats here too, but I wasn't sure what kind or whether they would come out in the snow or not. The western United States had a versatile grab bag of predators to choose from, and I was now ankle deep in the snow, being pursued by one of them. I stopped and called again, whistling loudly as I listened for Max, and when I heard a faint, familiar bark, I felt a flutter of happiness. He was alive, something I hadn't been entirely sure of, but before I could take a step, I heard a very distinct noise of the ice breaking behind me. It was followed by a second something to my left, and I felt my heart flutter mutinously. I wasn't alone. I broke into a run then, hearing them pursue me and not caring. I wanted to find Max. I wanted to get him on a lead and get out of here as quickly as possible. As scared as I was, and I was scared, I still didn't want anything to happen to my buddy. Max was just a big dumb dog. He didn't know that chasing rabbits could get him on the wrong side of something out here. I should have foreseen this when I was getting obedience training for him. If I was lucky, this would be a live and learn situation. If I wasn't, then I guess Max's next owner would have to do better. If he made it out, that was. As I ran, I could hear them getting closer. Sounded like there were more than two now, and the more I ran, the more of them there seemed to be. Sounded like a whole herd of whatevers by the time I caught sight of Max, and I put on a burst of speed, my lungs burning as something loomed up before me. I got a good look at my pursuer, and if it hadn't been so damn cold, I would have screamed. Standing between me and my dog, looking huge on its back legs, was a polar bear. It was bigger than any polar bear I had ever seen, a Kodiak-sized polar bear, and as it opened its mouth to roar, nothing came out. It lifted its paws to swipe me down, looking to bury me under its bulk, and I was helpless to stop. I could no more have come to a halt than I could have taken a sharp right turn, and I threw my hands up in some feeble attempt to defend myself. As I collided with the massive bear, however, I was surprised to feel not warm, wet fur, but cold, hard-packed snow. Hard-packed or not, my velocity took me straight through it, and the snow bear fell to pieces as I landed on the other side. I looked back, watching it break apart in total awe, and that's when I saw them. A pack had been right. There were 20 of the solid white snow bears behind me, and they had frozen like a perfect array of snow sculptures amidst the trees. Each was an intricately carved piece capable of winning a prize contest in any winter show, and each had chunky white teeth that looked anything but inviting. As I stood crouched in the snow, I wondered why they hadn't charged. Why were they just standing there? Did it only work if I wasn't looking at them? I didn't know, and I didn't care. Right then I could see Max barking and jumping around happily, and I wanted to get him back on his leash as fast as possible. Max was busy chasing the rabbit from earlier, but as he caught him and shook him viciously, I saw him fall into snowy pieces all around the dog. I ran up, wanting to get a leash on him before he could move off and maybe save the bunny if it was possible. As I came up to him, however, I saw that any body that might have existed was gone, and a new rabbit was slowly forming from the snowy ground. Max had bent to snap at this one too, but seemed to sense the approach of the snow creatures. Even as I attempted to coax him onto his leash, he growled, showing his teeth as his hackles came up, but I really didn't have time for him to test the stability of these snow animals. I'd barreled through one of them, but who knew if that was the norm? He acted confused as we ran into the woods, clearly not understanding why we were leaving, but as we ran, he seemed to think this was just another game. We ran flat out, trees whipping past us, and I could hear the animals coming up behind us. They weren't even trying to be subtle now. They were crunching through the snow like a pack of hungry animals, and when we broke through the trees and onto the road, I turned for home and kept hoofing it until our front door was in sight. I didn't let myself stop moving until the door was behind me and the locks were thrown. I don't go out as often as I used to, and after some research, I found a dog park in the neighborhood that I could take Max to. It's nowhere near the woods, and that seems to suit the both of us just fine. We had both had enough of the woods and decided that the snowy park was just fine. I did a little research and discovered that the woods I had run through often saw bodies turn up in the spring beneath the snowdrift. No one is quite sure why it is, but I feel like I may have some idea. It isn't just people either. I read the report, and they find a lot of dogs out there as well. Some of them have collars, some of them are strays, but there's a lot of missing people that are found with leashes in hand. I couldn't tell you what we found in the woods, but I'm glad to have survived it. It was one of the most frightening experiences of my life, and 8 years of that life was spent in an active war zone. No fear of death compares to being pursued through the woods by something that's hunting you for no better reason than sport. And there's nothing quite like being the prey as the winter wind deadens your lungs and the chill conquers your senses. Keep your eyes peeled if you walk the woods once the snows fall. Otherwise, they might find you too once the snows melt in the spring. Man, have you ever told stories from a hammock? I recommend it. Everybody should own at least one hammock. Well, you'll probably need the support strut on my front porch, too. It's pretty beefy. At least, I hope it is. Or, I may be telling you stories from the floor here in a moment. Moving right along, let's hear a story about when man's best friend maybe has its own agenda. Let's hear a story about a woman and why she left the woods. Yeah, it's just me here tonight, I said as I washed up a few dishes. The darkness outside seemed held at bay by the big floodlight on the pole. The forest surrounding our little cabin looked like a green wave that was preparing to swallow our circle of humanity up forever, and it was only thanks to that 120-watt bulb that we were saved. I had the phone pressed against my ear, and I laughed as my boyfriend said something funny. The phone slipped towards the soapy water, and I caught it just in time as something scratched at the door again. What? Nah, they haven't come home yet. Uncle Ricky doesn't usually like to be out in the woods after dark. I opened the back door as another loud scratch came from it, and Benji walked in. The mutt had been with our family for years, and as he lumbered in, he wagged his tail and gave me a big doggy grin. I wrinkled my nose with disgust when I noticed that he'd been rolling in something. There was red-brown crust all over his right side, and at first I mistook it for blood. When I saw he wasn't limping, though, I figured it was just mud, or worse, blood off of some carcass he'd rolled around in the woods. I started after him as he made his way towards the laundry room where his food bowls were, my boyfriend prattling away in my ear. Rick, I'm going to have to call you back, I said, making my way towards the laundry room before Benji could roll around on the clean laundry. Everything okay, babe? Yeah, but Benji rolled in something, and I don't want him to get it all over the house. Okay, well, stay safe. Love you. Love you too, Rick. See you tomorrow. I hung up the phone and took a step towards the laundry room. I had just reached for the bristle brush by the sink when my phone blared from the countertop. I turned away from Benji and walked towards the phone, checking the caller ID to see who it was. Brad's smiling face was plastered across the screen, and I picked it up on the third ring. I figured it would be them telling me they were on their way and running late. I didn't get 3 words out, however, before I was immediately buffeted by a wall of static and Brad's frantic voice yelling as he cut in and out. I held the phone a little away from my ear, like it might explode. Hello? Oh God, thank God, Rach. I need you to call the sheriff right now. His tone was equal parts terror and fury, and I was immediately worried. What happened? Is everything okay? Uncle Ricky's hurt pretty bad, and Dad's not in the best shape either. Dad says to call the sheriff and get an ambulance. Lock the door until we get there. Brad, what happened? Do it, Rachel. We'll be there in 5 minutes. Don't open the door for anyone until we get there. Then he hung up on me, and I was left looking at the silent brick. I tried the sheriff's office, but the phone just rang and rang before connecting me with static. The phone number for the ambulance did the same, and by this point, I was starting to get scared. Was there a problem with the phones in town? Had some disaster happened out in the woods that spilled over into town? As I went to lock the door, I saw the familiar headlights of Dad's old pickup coming up the driveway. I flung it open instead and went to help them. Dad came out of the back, hoisting Uncle Ricky under the arm, and Brad hopped out of the driver's seat and ran over to help him. Uncle Ricky hung limply between them, and I could see at a glance that he was not in good shape. His flannel shirt and jeans were covered in blood, and though it was hard to tell, I thought his left arm might be gone. Dad was covered in blood too, but it looked like some of it might be Uncle Rick's. He had 4 long claw marks running through his left eye, and it was swelling too badly for me to tell if the eye still worked. Brad shouted at me to get the door, and I complied as all 3 of them came running into the living room. In the light, it was easy to tell how bad Uncle Rick was. His arm was gone. The sleeve had been used to make a tourniquet around the stump, and his breathing was shallow as he lay on the couch in a state of unconsciousness. Brad said something about getting back for the guns, but Dad shut him down and sent us both to lock the doors. After the house was secure, Dad asked me if I'd called the sheriff or the ambulance. I told him about the strange static, and he swore loudly as he took his own cell phone out of his pocket. He dialed a number, and I could tell by his face that he was getting the same result. Finally, he swore and threw the phone against the wall. I guess we're on our own, he said, and it was the most hopeless sound I'd ever heard come out of my daddy. Even when Mama died, he'd still kept a strong face on for us. What's going on? What happened to Uncle Rick? I asked. Dad looked over at Brad, and after a silent conference, Dad started to tell it. We'd been hunting for most of the day. We hadn't caught a damn thing. Something was scaring the game off. We heard it walking around a few times and thought it was a bear. Your Uncle Rick said it smelled like a bear. So when the sun started going down, we decided it was time to pack it in. We started getting everything together. Right out of the blue, A doe steps out in the meadow. She looked around real skittish-like and starts cropping grass real quick. She clearly smelled whatever had been making that noise all day, but the deer has to eat, and she started filling her belly as quickly as she could. Your uncle sighted her up and dropped her real easy, and we figured at least we'd have one thing to show for our efforts. No sooner did we get to the edge of the meadow when a big old something comes crashing out. It grabbed our deer and bolted back into the woods like a bat out of hell. It kind of looked like a bear, I guess. The sun was setting and it was hard to tell, but it moved quicker than any bear I'd ever seen. Brad and I were just going to let it go, but Rick was mad as I'd ever seen him. He tore off after it, saying he was going to take that thing home instead. So we follow him, not wanting to leave him in the woods alone after dark, and we chased this thing into its cave. At that point, I was sure it was a bear, so we go creeping in, trying to surprise it. As the sun sets behind us, we see this thing hunkered over the deer, and it weren't no bear. It's wolfing at the deer, just slurping down big mouthfuls, and Rick gets real pale and starts gibbering about how it's the thing that we saw when we were kids. Wait, I interrupted, you've seen this thing before? Dad looked perturbed, but nodded. Yeah, that's why Rick hated to go into the woods after dark. When we were teenagers, we were up in a stand, hunting deer. Rick sights one before sunset, and he drops it, much like we had tonight. We're about to go get it when this big thing comes out of the woods and starts wolfing it down right there in the meadow. Well, you know your Uncle Rick. He always had a temper. So he pops off a shot at it. Hits it too, but that don't do nothing but piss it off. It comes roaring and charging up to the bottom of our tree and starts clawing and pushing until it topples it over. We jump out just as it hits the ground and just go tearing off running for the truck. And that was what you saw today? Well, Dad hedged, it was almost dark when we shot the deer, and we never got a good look at it. All I know is that's what chased us out of the woods, and Rick wouldn't go hunting with us for the next 3 years after that. He paused for a minute to make sure I was out of questions before continuing his story. So with Rick gibbering, this thing looks up and sees us. I swear to you that it came up on its hind legs and walked like a man as it ran at us. Rick pops a shot off, probably just panic fire, but it just shrugs it off and lands on him. I saw his arm, rifle and all, go into its mouth, and I heard it crunch as it bit it clean off. Rick starts screaming, and we all start yelling. Before it can finish him off, though, Brad and I pepper it 4 or 5 times with buckshot. It must have dazed it, because it rolled off of Rick with a loud shriek and stumbled back towards the cave. It sounded like a man screaming, Brad said, and Dad nodded before going on. It starts flailing around in pain, and we grabbed Rick and start dragging him back towards the truck. This thing came after us, and it sounded like it was crashing through the trees the whole way. We couldn't move very fast. Each of us had an arm under Rick as we drug him along, and I swear it would have had us if it hadn't been for Benji. My blood suddenly ran cold. Benji? Yeah, poor little guy. He's been with us the whole time. He didn't seem to want anything to do with that thing, but when it jumped on us again and raked my face, he started growling and lunges right at it. I hear them tearing and snarling at each other, and we just hightailed it back to the truck. It's a wonder we ever found it in the dark. Poor old Benji. He sacrificed himself so we could get away. Both Brad and my dad looked forlorn, but I just shook my head. No, he didn't. He's right here. Dad gave me a funny look. What are you talking about? He came wandering in not long before you guys did. That's when I remembered the blood on his fur. There was no way he could outrun the truck. Hell, the only reason I hadn't questioned it was because I had forgotten he had gone with him. I looked back towards the kitchen door, and it creaked open as Benji's friendly grin poked through the gap. He strolled into the living room, his fur still a mess of blood and mud, and glanced around the room as his tail wagged and his big old doggy smile stretched across his face. When he stepped up on his hind legs, I thought for sure I was dreaming. Benji leapt across the living room, and when he hit the couch, he was no longer the cuddly mutt we'd all come to love. He was 200 pounds of sleek black fur and raking claws that reduced my family to a spray of blood and screams of mercy. I fell back from the scene, covering my eyes with my hands to block it all out. I could still hear every bone-wrenching yank, every blood-splattering swipe, and every watery gurgle as my family had their throats torn out. I was numb. My mind shrank away from the scene before me as I backpedaled until my back hit the wall of the cabin. I curled my knees up to my chest and put my head against my knees as I sank to the floor and waited for it to be over. I didn't care at that moment whether I lived or died. I only wanted it to end. I could feel myself crying as the living room became a killing field. And when it finally ended, I could hear the overpowering bray of my explosive sobs. My sobs stopped when I heard heavy footsteps walking towards me. I didn't look up. I didn't want to look up. But when the creature's hot breath puffed against the top of my head, I pulled my face away from my knees despite myself. His blood-smeared face was inches from mine, and I quickly buried my face against my knees again. It was leaning over me, my family's blood pattering onto my skin, and it was all I could do not to pass out from terror. We stayed like that for several minutes, until I couldn't take it anymore. I lifted my head and looked at this semi-feline face and asked the question, Why haven't you killed me yet?" His voice was high, like a bee that's been caught in a jar, and it hurt my ears to listen to him. "Because you helped me. For that favor, I will give you a favor in return. Leave my woods before sunset tomorrow, and I will allow you to continue to exist. Stay, and you will share the fate of your kin." Then he turned and walked out of the house on 2 legs. I was gone before the sun came up. I threw my clothes in a bag, took the pickup my brother had been careless enough to leave the keys in, and drove. My phone rang a few times, but I ignored it. The hardest was when Aunt Clara called, but after 3 days, even she stopped calling. They likely assumed I was dead too. I sold the truck before I left the state and haven't looked back. I drove until I couldn't see the forest anymore. I drove until I couldn't see 3 trees grouped close enough to obscure anything. And when the desert stretched out before me, I finally stopped. I'll make my life here now. I have no intention of ever leaving the desert again. I don't know what forest this creature calls its own, and I never want to find out. Some days I could just sit out on this porch all day long. Just a rambly old man telling stories in a hammock around a fire in the middle of the day. My neighbors must think I've lost my mind. Moving along, we have a story about where all good boys go. A story about a common place for dogs to find a home when their time on Earth may be at an end. So let's take a trip to an old farm and find out what happens when they go out to pasture. I knew there was no way I could have seen him, but I could swear I saw my old dog, Blue, standing near the fence of Sanders' farm. I work out of town, the town I grew up in being pretty tiny, and I have to pass Sanders' farm anytime I come home from work. Sanders' farm has been a landmark since before I was born, and it grows most of the produce for town. Herschel Sanders runs a very successful produce stand in town and sells crops to grocery stores all over the state. He's a bit of a local celebrity, and he seems to be the only person in town doing well for himself besides Cotton's Antiques. He also owned the farm my parents were supposed to have dropped Blue off to when I was a kid. Blue had been a good dog, a great companion for a kid my age, but maybe a little too rambunctious for my parents' liking. He'd been a mutt with pointy ears, a thick coat of soft brown fur, and a pair of green, inquisitive eyes that never seemed to get tired of darting around for something to chase or catch. I loved him, but for 2 adults in a small house, we lived in an apartment at the time, he must have been a nightmare. The day he bit Tommy was probably one of the worst days I remember, so, of course, it was indelibly etched in my memory forever. Tommy was a lot older than me or my friends. He was 12, and we all lived in fear of him. Whenever he strode onto the little playground area off the apartment complex, 5'8" and broad in the chest, we all usually left to go play somewhere else. Unfortunately, on that day, I was playing alone on the basketball court and didn't have time to escape. I'd been shooting baskets. I wanted to join the elementary school basketball league next year, so I wanted to get good. That's when Tommy came striding up. Blue was panting about good-naturedly, but looked up when he saw Tommy coming. He was always alone, never having any chums to play around with, and that should have been a red flag to any adult that had been watching. Even the most brutal of children have someone to pal around with, but Tommy was too antisocial and stupid mean for even other bullies to accept. "What you doing, sissy?" he asked, dragging out his limited insults he reserved for sissies or babies. I told him I was just shooting baskets, and he sneered like that was the silliest thing he'd ever heard. "That's not how you get better, stupid. Why don't you play me one-on-one? That'll get you better quicker." I agreed, thinking maybe he had decided to be friendlier. Nothing could have been further from the truth. The game started out with him taking the ball from me and scoring point after point. I was smaller than him, so it was easy for him to steal the ball from me and rack up points while I stumbled around. After a while, I started developing some strategies to get around him, though, and I started making some points on my own. Before I knew it, we were nearly tied, and this was unacceptable to Tommy. The game had been dirty before, but now it was downright brutal. The first time he pushed me, I heard Blue growl a warning. The second time he pushed me, I heard Blue snarl at him. On the third time, his fist coming down to crack me on the side of the head, I heard him yell as Blue sank his teeth into Tommy's backside. Tommy cried out, telling me to get my dog off him. I was shocked. I'd never seen Blue bite anyone. He hung onto the back of his jeans, worrying at him, as Tommy ran off the blacktop towards his house. He let him go as his sneakers left the court, and I laughed about it then, Blue grinning his doggy grin as he came back to rub against my hand. When the police arrived at my house later that day, I didn't think it was so funny. They told us that Tommy's parents had reported a dog bite. Specifically, they had reported that Blue had bitten their son, and now the police had come to take him away. I told them my side of the story, all the while clutching Blue around the neck, but it didn't seem to make any difference to them. A dog had bit, and now he had to be put down. I think Dad saw that I was getting really upset, because he agreed to take Blue to the police station and said he wouldn't let them put him to sleep unless I got to say goodbye. This soothed me a little, but I was still pretty upset as I watched my dog walk away for the last time. When Dad came back, it was already nighttime, but he seemed a little happier. He told me that he had come to an understanding with the police officers, and they had let him drop Blue off at Sanders' farm. Dad said that Mr. Sanders usually took in troubled dogs, or dogs that were going to be put down, and let them work on his farm as farm dogs. That way, Blue could live there, and he wouldn't have to be put to sleep. He'll have all kinds of room to run around, much, much more room than this little apartment, and he'll be happy, Dad had said. I was ecstatic. I was sad that Blue couldn't live with us anymore, but at least the police wouldn't have to put him to sleep. I asked Dad if we could go visit him sometime, to see how he was doing, and Dad said we would see. I went to bed that night and dreamed about Blue as he ran and ran on the farm, herding sheep and running off crows and enjoying his life now that he had a lot of space to play in. I asked Dad a few times if we could go see Blue, but it never seemed to be a good time. Dad always said things like he didn't want to distract him while he was at work, or he didn't want to make it hard for him to settle in by reminding him about his old family. I understood these things. They made sense, but I really wanted to see Blue again. I remember asking a handful of times, but like most kids, my attention span was pretty limited. I got a new game console that year for Christmas. I made the basketball team, so I had to practice almost every day. I was getting ready to go to middle school, so I was a little worried about that. And after a while, I just sort of forgot about Blue. I never really forgot about him. I still thought about him sometimes, in that vague way that kids often do, but I just stopped asking to go see him. Eventually, I guess I stopped thinking about him. Until today, when I saw him on the fence, I hadn't honestly thought about him in years. I was heading to dinner with my parents after work, so I figured I'd let them know what I'd seen. They might like knowing that Blue was okay, and that he was still living a good life. Mom opened the door for me when I knocked, and invited me to help finish fixing dinner. As I chopped vegetables for a salad, I told her what I'd seen, but she didn't seem to understand. The chunk of the knife seemed soothing as it cut the vegetables, and I told her that I'd seen Blue running around the farm where we'd left him. She still seemed a little confused, not really understanding what I was talking about, and when Dad came in, I told him as well. Dad didn't seem confused at all, though. Quite the contrary. He looked a little scared. You saw Blue at Sanders' farm? Yeah, just where you said you dropped him off. He looked really happy. He was running around, chasing birds, and living his best life. He looked up when I drove past and almost seemed to recognize me. I was thinking that I might go visit him, see if he's still... Kid, Dad stated, cutting me off. That's impossible. I guess you're right, I said, thinking it over as we talked about it. Blue would have to be 20 years old by now. Maybe it's one of his puppies. It looks just like him. I might stop by anyway, see if maybe Mr. Sanders will sell me one of Blue's puppies. It would be nice to have a reminder of old Blue around the apartment. My dad sat down heavily, and that made me look up at him with real worry. He seemed like he was debating something, or maybe having a hard time accepting something. I was worried for a minute that he might be having a heart attack. He'd had one last year, and after that his heart hadn't exactly been stable. Instead, he just looked up at me like he might have seen a ghost or something. That's not possible, because Blue is dead. I looked at him in shock. How do you know? Did Mr. Sanders tell you when he didn't have to. Blue died the night I took him to the police station. We put him down. My head spun a little. Had they been lying to me this whole time? Dad had told me he'd taken Blue to the farm. He had stuck to that story till eventually I forgot. Had he just been telling me a lie to stop me from being upset? Why had he told me about taking Blue to the farm at all? Sit down. I think it's time I tell you the truth. It's the truth you may have to face yourself one day, so it's best you hear it now. I sat down, keeping a close eye on my old man, who suddenly seemed less trustworthy than he had a few minutes ago. People in this town always say that they're taking their dogs to the farm. It's been a tradition for at least as long as I can remember. My own dad told me he was taking my dog Scout to Sanders' farm when he got too old and too sick. He said that Scout could run and play for as long as he wanted, and the country air would do him some good. My daddy had never lied to me before, at least not that I knew of, and I was happy that Scout could live somewhere where he could get better. He was old and really sick. I wasn't quite ready to say goodbye to him yet, though. Daddy said we could visit him, but we never did. Eventually, just like you, I kind of forgot about him and went on with my life. I sat in silence, not really sure what to make of all this. So Granddad had lied as well, but this seemed to be a generational lie. Why did so many people use Sanders' farm as a place to leave their dogs? Was it a convenient lie? Or was there more to it? Why did you lie to me? I asked, still not happy about being misled. Because I knew that Blue was going to be killed, and I knew that you weren't ready to lose him. Taking him to the farm was just something people tell kids around here. I'd imagine that you have a lot of friends who've had their dogs taken to Sanders' farm over the years. But why? What's the point of it all? Dad seemed to think about this, weighing his options before settling on, you'll understand when you're older, when you have kids of your own. Sanders' farm is an important place in this community for many reasons, some of them not quite known even to the people who use it. I didn't end up staying for dinner. I left, despite my mother's protests, and drove home. I don't know why, but I was just so irrationally mad about being lied to. I realized, of course, that my parents had lied like this before. I've lived with the Easter Bunny, the Tooth Fairy, Santa Claus, and even a monster that lived in the basement named Mr. Giles, who would get you if you came downstairs after bedtime. They all turned out to be fake, of course. They were lies they told, but lies that they told gently, and only to add magic to my childhood or keep me from doing foolish things. I could understand those lies, but not this one. This one felt different. This one felt personal. I flopped onto the couch when I got home, and John paused his game as he glanced over at me. What's wrong, babe? You look upset. It's nothing, I lied, looking away before finally spilling the whole sad story. I was in tears by the end, my boyfriend holding my hands and patting them gently. He'd grown up here too, and had known my parents only slightly less time than I had. He often gave me some perspective on what was going on, and was my voice of reason in many things. I'm sure your dad had a good reason. He's a good man, and I don't feel like he'd lie to you for no reason. He probably just wanted to protect you. You were 8 after all. He slid his thumbs over the backs of my hands like I liked, and I smiled as I bent forward to kiss his forehead. Thanks, hon. You always know just what to say. John grinned through his beard and reached for the controller again. Boy-friendly duties now complete. Besides, it's not all that weird if you think about it. I cocked an eye at him. What do you mean? Well, that's where my dad took Russell after he got hit by that car. He told me he took him to Mr. Sanders' farm so he could get better, but I guess he never did. That gave me pause. John had basically told me the same story my dad had, and it was a little too similar for coincidence. As John went back to rolling and smashing anything that wandered into his field of vision, I opened my phone and sent a text to my friend Matt. Matt and I had been friends nearly as long as John and I had, and I trusted him as much as I trusted my boyfriend. Hey Matt, just wondering if you've ever heard your parents say anything about taking one of your pets to Sanders' farm. Just curious, trying to settle a bet. The last bit would really hook him. He seemed to like making John look dumb by proving him wrong. I watched John play Elden Ring for a few more minutes before my phone buzzed and I picked it up to see his reply. Wow, that's weird. Yeah, my dad took Snoopy there after he got too old to walk. I haven't thought about that in forever. That's trippy. I thanked him and sent a text to Jane, a friend from work. Jane lived in the next town over, but Kine was still only about 20 minutes from my hometown. I was wondering if this was just a regional thing, or if it extended farther than our little burg. Janet sent back a string of question marks and asked why I needed to know something so weird. I told her it was to settle a bet too, and she told me she'd never had a dog get taken to Sanders' farm. We always just buried them in the backyard, she said. Okay, so maybe it wasn't particularly far-reaching. For the next few hours, as John cursed and growled at the maddening boss he was trying to beat, I sent text after Facebook message after Twitter message and everything in between to old school friends and people I knew from town to ask them if they'd lost dogs too. John's story about Russell had made me realize this was bigger than just my family, and I wanted to know how far exactly. Of the 10 people I got responses from, 6 said their parents had told them they were taking dogs to Sanders' farm. One friend only had cats growing up, and it appeared that they didn't get to live a happy life on Sanders' farm. The other 2 had never been allowed to have pets, so they'd never had anything to lose. The one person whose dog hadn't gone to Sanders' farm had escaped while the family was on vacation, so the whereabouts of the dog were never discovered. The findings were inconclusive, but they were still pretty damn close. Close enough that as John and I climbed into bed that night, I had already decided that I was going to make a stop on my way home from work tomorrow. The plume of dirt that spewed up behind me as I drove up the long driveway to Sanders' farm was the only bell the old farmer seemed to need. He was waiting for me on the porch with a glass of tea, and a weathered old smile spread across his sunburnt face. "Afternoon, kid. What can I do for you?" We shook hands as I introduced myself, and he handed me the glass of tea as I explained why I was there. Mr. Sanders nodded, asking if I'd like to come inside. He didn't seem surprised by the question at all. Quite the contrary. It was as if he'd been waiting for me to come and ask it all this time. I told him that I thought I'd rather sit on the porch and discuss it, and he nodded as he took a seat in one of the old rockers, indicating that I should take the other. Every now and again, someone puts 2 and 2 together and realizes that everyone brings their dogs to Sanders' farm. It's not a new concept. People have been doing it since before the Great Depression. I can't tell you how long it's been going on, but I can tell you how it started if you'd like to hear. I nodded, and he began his story. The first dog to be brought here wasn't really brought at all. His name was Jip, and he was my friend. He was just a pup when I heard him crying one afternoon. He'd gotten himself stuck in a trap, and his pack had deserted him, probably thinking he was done for. He was just a little half-starved thing, but he growled at me as I came to get him loose. Turned out I didn't have to do too much. The trap had nearly tore his front paw off, and he was bleeding out. It seemed a shame to let him die, so I held him down and tied his foot off with a handkerchief. He struggled a lot, snapping and snarling as I tried to stop the bleeding, but eventually he quieted down as the blood oozed out of him and he became less coherent. I scooped him up and took him back home, cutting the little bit of skin off that held his paw on and dressing it as best I could. I was afraid he had died for a little while, but when I heard him come to, snarling and snuffling and howling, I knew he'd likely recover. He smiled as he remembered it, likely thinking of the little wolf pup as he tried to act twice his size. We started off slow, but eventually I earned his trust. His paw would never grow back, but he managed to teach himself to walk with 3 legs. I had done a good enough job of cleaning it up that it didn't get infected, and after a few months, the lack of a paw didn't seem to slow him down. He couldn't return to his pack. I'm not sure he ever even tried, but he was my dog after that, and I loved him. His smile became sad, and I felt we were about to come to the part of the story where he lost that friend. We lived together for about 12 years, both of us growing old as the seasons passed. Jip's gait was slower, and his joints creaked when he walked, but he was still always willing to walk around with me when I did my work. I was in my late 40s, working the land as I do now, when we stumbled upon a bear one day. He had decided to bed down in my corn crib, and when I went down to check my stores, he woke up and charged me. Jip got between us. He was never far from my side, and gave me time to get my rifle. I put the bear down as the 3-legged wolf kept him from attacking me, but the damage was done. Jip had been slashed a dozen times, and I sat with him as he lay bleeding on the dirt floor of my storehouse. Mr. Sanders got a far-off look as he watched the sun sink, seeing far-off days as the sun set over his crops. I buried him in the field, the place he loved the most. I'd built him a house, put him a ratty blanket on the porch, but he seemed to love sleeping amongst the swaying corn plants and amidst the dirt of the field. I buried him there, thinking he might nourish the crops as his spirit lay content, but I never could have foreseen what would happen. That night, I heard a loud barking, a barking that sounded like Jip's. I rushed out with my rifle and found him smiling and barking at the edge of the field, good as new. Behind him, though, the crops had grown 4 times as plentiful. Corn and beans and squash and potatoes, everything else I grew in those days, too. Jip looked at me as though to say, "Thanks for a good life," and then he dove back into the field and I never saw him again. That was how it started. "Well, what started?" I asked, feeling my skin prickle. "The crops came in, and I brought my wares to the nearest market. I made enough money to build a new barn, buy a new horse, and eat like a king that winter. There had been enough food to stuff my storehouse, and the excess I'd taken to market was more like a normal yield from any other year. The next year I planted as I had every year, and old Jip brought in another bountiful harvest. I bought more land, made plans to plant an orchard, began to think about buying cattle and sheep. I even thought about becoming some kind of land baron in this underdeveloped part of the country. The next 2 years were just as fine, but I was in for a surprise." He coughed a little and asked me if I'd get him a glass of tea from the kitchen. I obliged, moving into the house and taking a glass from the cabinet as I moved to the battered old fridge. I refilled my own as I poured the cold tea into the new glass. I was suddenly very thirsty, and my throat felt dry as a bone. When I brought it back to him, he thanked me before taking a long sip. After 4 years of amazing yield, the 5th year was a disappointment. The crops did well as they ever did before Jip died, but the bounty was nowhere to be seen. I had just begun planting the fruit trees and just started making inquiries about livestock. I worried that I wouldn't be able to afford any of the plans I'd been making, and that temporary success might just slip through my fingers. The next year was much the same, but I had noticed a small decline in the quality of my produce. There had been no blight, no insects to speak of, but the crops seemed weaker, more feeble this year. I began to panic. What would I do if the fields stopped making? What could I do if the vegetables stopped coming? I tried different things that spring to rejuvenate the fields. I bought tonics from a traveling man. I put down fertilizer. I tried increasing the water I gave the fields. The fertilizer, however, had made me remember that I had used something very different to fertilize the land 4 years ago, and that made me wonder if doing so might rejuvenate the fields again. The sun was sinking lower now, the fiery ring just over the tops of the corn as they waved merrily. And so I set out to find a proper sacrifice for the land, something to bring it back again. I tried forest animals. Jip had been of the forest after all, but to no avail. I tried strays from the nearby town, but they did nothing. In my desperation, I'm ashamed to say that I bought and killed animals from the local stableman, even going so far as to buy and slaughter a horse, but they did little to rejuvenate the crop. Then one evening, as I came back from the market with my pathetic yield, I nearly struck a child as he came bounding into the road. The dog with him, just an average mutt, pushed him out of the way, and my tires crunched over the animal. I heard the boy cry out in despair as he cradled the dying dog in his arms. Its back was clearly broken, but I wasted no time. I took the dog with me, driving away quickly as the father came rushing out to see what all the fuss was about. The setting sun cut fire lines across his eyes, and the sting must have been uncomfortable, if not eye-watering. Mr. Sanders seemed not to notice, though. He was dead by the time I arrived home, and I buried him in the field, as I had with Gyp. The crops came back, the land thrived, and I think that was when I realized what the land wanted. The old dog had been loved, just as Gyp had been loved, and that love seemed to nourish the land like nothing else. From that day on, I seemed to always have my eyes peeled for dogs. The sick ones could sometimes be taken off the owner's hands, but I had been known to buy them from struggling families as well. As the years went by and the town grew, so too did my prosperity. I was one of the largest farmers in the region. My produce sold at every general store and market for miles around. I've seen the horses replaced by automobiles, seen the carts that came to get my food replaced by trucks, and all the while, my fields continued to put out more of the stuff I needed to grow. Ah, but there was a price, and the price has become quite steep over the years. I was still mulling over what he had said, and when he paused to drain the dregs of his glass, I asked the question that had been wavering on the edge of my mind. "Mr. Sanders, how old are you?" Mr. Sanders fixed me with a mischievous grin, and it took years off of him. "Just starting to put it together, eh? I was born in 1815. I bought this land in 1845. The year I buried Gyp, I was 45, and I have stayed that age ever since. Despite having more crops than I know what to do with, the land also grants me life for my sacrifice. I can't explain why, and I can't explain how, but I keep living as long as the land thrives." I wanted to deny what he was saying, but I could find no argument against it. The man looked old, sun-weathered, but not ancient. How would he manage to keep from being noticed? If he had really owned this farm for so long, how had no one seen? As my farm grew, so too did the town. The market thrived, the people prospered, and thus began the agreement. I had grown tired of finding my own sacrifices, so I made them a deal. They would bring me their dogs, those who were sick or those who were too old to carry on, and I would continue to make the town flourish. By that time, I was making a sacrifice once a month. Today, I make a sacrifice once a day. Before too long, I fear that it will become unmanageable, and the farm will fail." I said nothing, just sitting and staring, wishing I could believe that this man was crazy. I suppose that wouldn't be too bad. I've grown tired of living and making sacrifices, and maybe it's finally time to rest. Nothing lasts forever, after all, not even immortality, he said, grinning. The grin made his face look skeletal, his true age shining through at last. I thanked him for the tea, thanked him for the story, and stood up shakily. "Take care of yourself, kid, and don't worry. Old Blue is as happy as any other dog here. You did what you could for him, and now he's at rest where no one can hurt him ever again." I nodded dumbly, my legs shivering as I walked down the stairs to my car. As I climbed in, I thought I saw a familiar brown snout as it poked from the rows of corn plants. My hands froze halfway to the ignition. He was grinning at me, looking out through the corn and panting happily. It was as if he had come back one last time to say goodbye, and as we locked eyes, He slid slowly back into the field. I've driven by that farm once a day since, but I've never seen Blue again. I do worry, though, about what will happen to all those ghosts if something should happen to Sanders' farm. The crops have begun to look a little different lately, less healthy, more like plants that are rotting from the inside. If the vegetables die, if the farm fails, then what will happen to all those spirits that call the land their home? There was a sign next to the dirt road today that said, "For sale by owner." I suppose soon we may very well find out. One more story for you, and I promise I've saved the best for last. Probably one of my most popular dog stories, and it also happens to be a pretty good Halloween story too. So, let's hear a story about when the friendship between a boy and his dog lives on past their lifespan. Let's hear a little bit about the Halloween visitor.
Come on, Dad, let's go! Lily stomped a slipper-clad foot on the sidewalk as she looked back at her father. She was ready to go trick-or-treating, and it seemed like nothing but Josh was standing in the way of her sweet treats. He was sitting on the front step of his childhood home, a well-loved cul-de-sac teeming with costumed children. The moon hung overhead, a ghostly sickle that presided over this Halloween night, and her dad was sitting with his back against the smooth stairs, as he found his eyes tracking the multitudes as they passed. The children laughed and screamed as they stalked by, the street a sea of superheroes, video game characters, colorful animals, and everything in between. He let his eyes drift past the excited pageantry, though. He was looking for one shape in particular. Josh's mom smiled at him, slipping her hand into Lily's and giving her a little tug. "Come on, hun. Your dad's waiting for someone. We'll go trick-or-treating while he waits." Lily looked interested. "Who are you waiting for, Daddy?" Of course, she wouldn't have remembered from last year. She'd been excited about trick-or-treating, showing off her Wonder Woman costume, and swinging between her father and her mother's hands as they walked. However, Laura was 6 months pregnant this year, and had opted out of the hour drive to get to his mother's house. She had smiled at Josh knowingly as he left, and told him to tell her hi for her. Lily's grandmother smoothed her hair as it sat under the tall princess hat. "It's just an old friend, dear. Your father meets him here every year." "Well, you're gonna miss out on the candy," Lily said, her tone stating firmly that she wouldn't be sharing if he didn't come. Josh smiled. "That's okay, Lily. You go and have fun with Grandma, okay?" Lily just shrugged, her grandmother's tugging hand finally leading her towards the waiting cacophony of spooky delights. She glanced back as they walked onto the street, but was soon lost in the crowd and probably wouldn't remember anything about this conversation until next year. Josh leaned back, getting comfy as he waited for him to arrive. He did this every year, every Halloween after that first so many years ago. In many ways, the visits were what Josh looked forward to the most about Halloween. Sure, the candy was nice, the costumes were great, but seeing his friend was why he always came home for Halloween. No matter where Josh was, no matter what he was doing, he always came home for Halloween. This was the night he got to see him. This was the night that Josh got to see Snarf again. Snarf had been a mutt. He was a bull terrier mixed with a basset hound mixed with God only knew what else. They had grown up together. Snarf was just a puppy when Josh had got him, and he was Josh's best friend for many years. When Josh thought back on that time in his life, he was glad he had gotten Snarf when he did. Kindergarten had been a difficult time for him, and his sheltered upbringing hadn't really prepared him for suddenly being around so many children. He was awkward, and not what you would call popular. He had thick glasses, was overweight, and his isolation had made him painfully shy. The other kids who had gone to daycare and Cub Scouts and T-ball together, took one look at him and dismissed him as a social outcast. It was tough, being unwanted at the age of 5. His mom thought a dog might help Josh's confidence, or at least ease some of the loneliness. In many ways, Josh believed his mother had recognized that the funk he was in was partially her fault, and was trying to make amends. She worked 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, and often Josh was left in the care of his grandmother. She loved him and always doted on him, but she wasn't always up for the games a 5-year-old would be interested in. Thinking about it over the years, Josh often thought that Snarf was a way for her to alleviate some of the guilt about leaving him alone. Whatever the reason, He had loved her for it. His mother found Snarf at the Humane Society. He was a little smiling ball of fluff, and when he put his feet against the glass, she had known that he would be perfect. He had been waiting for Josh when she had come to pick him up that day, and the boy's surprise had turned to joy as the wet puppy tongue slid over his face. They sat in the back seat the whole way home, the dog's head against his stomach, panting happily as Josh scratched him behind the ears. He was that rare animal whose temperament never led him to jump up on people or bark for no reason. His accidents were few and far between, and he was easy to house train. They called him Snarf because he had a deviation in his nose that caused him to make a snarfing sound rather than a proper bark. He was the best dog, the only one Josh had ever owned, and Josh had flourished with the help of his new companion. Snarf had gotten him out of the house, helping him shed some of the baby fat that had made him the subject of so much ridicule. He had also been a great icebreaker to help Josh introduce himself to some of the neighborhood kids. By the time he had entered first grade, Josh had a few pals, but none of them could hold a candle to his friendship with that wiggling little mass of fur and ears. He was eternally thankful for the time he'd gotten with Snarf, but it would never have been enough. Josh dumped a fistful of candy into each of their buckets, and the trio of Disney princesses said thank you as they ran to the next house in a flurry of skirts and sneakers. A pirate wandered up and gave him his best "Arg!" Josh rewarded him with a couple of full-size Snicker bars, and he thanked him before wobbling off on his fake peg leg. Josh kept scanning the crowd, unsure what was taking his friend so long this year. He was usually here by now, but he had been late before. He sat up a little as he saw a small ghost, 4 legs poking from below a bedsheet. When it turned and wagged its tail at a larger ghost who was walking behind it, Josh got comfortable again. He sat scanning around, hoping it wouldn't be too much longer. He'd sit here all night if he had to, though. Josh would sit here till midnight if it bought him 5 minutes with his buddy. Josh had Snarf for 5 years, and those 5 years were filled with mostly good times between a boy and his dog. Snarf was never a chewer or prone to digging holes, and Josh couldn't remember ever having to fill in a hole or run after him as he chased a cat. Snarf also knew where the boundaries of his home were, and Josh never saw him run out of the yard or get in the road after a car. He was a good boy, and the neighborhood loved him. He would likely have a long and happy life if it hadn't been for Josh. To this day, he blamed himself for what had happened to Snarf. It had all started when Reggie moved into the neighborhood. Reggie moved in when Josh was 10, and his family took up residence in the Cranston house. Mr. Cranston had died about a month before, and though his family hadn't been neighbors with them, Mr. Cranston was a nice old man who was known to the whole neighborhood. He had always had the best yard displays for Christmas or Halloween, and he had given out the best candy to trick-or-treaters. When the ambulance came to take him away one night, everyone had hoped for the best, but poor Mr. Cranston had died of a heart attack. Luckily, he had been on the phone with his daughter when it had happened, or who knows when they would have found him. So when a moving van came up the street bound for Mr. Cranston's old house, Josh and his friends had hopped on their bikes and went to check it out. Josh had a group of friends that he hung out with then. Terry, Walt, and Patrick lived in the same neighborhood as he did, and they'd been friends for years. When the new boy was seen unpacking boxes from the van, they introduced themselves and welcomed him to the neighborhood. He was a big kid, tall and muscular, and Josh had gotten a weird feeling about him almost at once. "I'm Josh," he said, extending a hand. "We were just about to go play some ball if you're interested." "Reggie," the boy said, squeezing his hand a little too hard, almost like he meant to hurt him. "Yeah, sounds like that might be fun." One short conversation was enough to let the boys know that Reggie's interests were different than theirs. Most of them had agreed later that they felt he probably wasn't going to be a good fit for the group, and not just because of his attitude. He had scoffed at their comic books, asked if they were babies when they talked about action figures, and when he'd said that baseball sounded fun, it made everyone shiver a little. He was large, a sneering boy, and they all decided to keep their distance from him as they said their goodbyes and pedaled away. But of course, Reggie lived on the block, so he inevitably found a place in their games. He was never invited, always just sort of invited himself. He made the teams uneven, and no one seemed to want him to play, but the boys were too polite to tell him to buzz off. That was how it started, but Josh and his friends had regretted giving in so easily almost at once. They'd been correct in their assumptions that he liked to hurt people. He had nearly broken Patrick's wrist when he fouled him during basketball. He had shoved Terry off his bike during a bike race, skinning both his hands and his knees, and every time he threw a football to you, you either caught it or you wound up with a bloody nose. By the end of the summer, their politeness had turned into fear, and they were all too afraid of him to tell him to go away when he came to invite himself to their games. They were playing baseball when it happened. Reggie had seen them setting up and inserted himself into the game, as he usually did. Terry sighed loudly, covering it up with a cough when Reggie got close enough to hear them. Josh and Terry had tried to explain that letting him play would make the teams uneven, but Reggie didn't really care. He made it pretty clear that he was going to play whether they liked it or not, and there wasn't really anything that could be done about it. Snarf had walked up then, snuffling Josh's hand for pats, and Josh had dropped to his knees to give him scratches. The dog accepted the attention, but his eyes never left Reggie, and Josh could see the mistrust in them. Reggie was the only person that Josh had ever seen elicit a growl from the usually good-natured dog. Reggie had quickly learned not to come into Josh's yard, as Snarf would not tolerate him. This was fine with Josh, because unlike the others, whose houses Reggie frequently visited, Snarf had kept him out of his yard and his fingers off of Josh's stuff. Josh was also careful to keep Snarf inside when he wasn't out there to supervise him. He had seen the way Reggie's piggy little eyes narrowed when he looked at the dog, and Josh knew enough to be cautious. He wished he'd just put Snarf inside when he started growling that day, but he had pushed it away and hoped it would help Reggie know that they wouldn't tolerate any funny business. The game had gone about as well as expected until the 5th inning. Reggie and Terry had been team captains, and Reggie had won the coin toss, so he got to pick first. Reggie and Walt had been on a team, and Terry and Josh had been on another, with Patrick acting as an umpire or standing in if someone got tired. Reggie had belted a few down the road, and he and Walt were winning 7-3. The trade-off for Reggie's freakish strength was that he wasn't particularly coordinated. He missed a few fly balls and let a few slide between his legs, so Josh and Terry weren't as far behind as they could have been. There had been some good-natured shoving, as good-natured as it ever got with Reggie, but there was no real violence to speak of. Snarf had gone to lounge on his lawn, and the boys were actually having fun, despite 4 of them having to keep an eye on the 5th. It all went south when Reggie took the plate again. He cracked it a good one, and Josh and Terry prepared to get out of the way as Reggie ran. Reggie did not believe in dropping the bat after hitting the ball, as the bruises on the boys' ankles could attest. The bat made a loud crack as it hit the ball, and as it sailed off down the street, Josh made a dash for it. Reggie came running around first base, Terry hovering between second and third, as Patrick stood on the manhole that was serving as the pitcher's mound. Patrick had quickly figured out that a third might be required when the teams took the field, and had agreed to be the pitcher and the umpire. Walt was whistling as Reggie ran for second, and the ball bounced once before Josh grabbed it. He had turned to throw it when he heard Terry yell out in pain. Terry, Walt would later tell him, had tripped Reggie as he ran past, and the big boy had fallen and skinned his hands and knees. Reggie had come up mad, cracking him in the stomach with the bat, and towering over him as the fallen boy prepared to have his skull caved in. Josh dropped the ball, sprinting towards the pair, as Reggie lifted the bat up to hit Terry again. Walt ran from the sidelines as Patrick came shouting and telling Reggie to knock it off. All 3 of them knew they wouldn't make it before he hit Terry, and they were just hoping to get there before he hit him again. Fast as they were, though, Snarf was faster. Snarf hit Reggie in the back, sending him reeling forward and dropping him into the street a second time. He stood over Terry protectively, snarling and showing his teeth at Reggie's back. Reggie was getting back up, shaking his head, but Snarf didn't seem to want to attack him. He just stood over Terry, the boy still frozen in surprise and fear. Reggie got back on his feet, his knuckles turning white against the bat's handle as he squeezed. Josh saw him turn in slow motion, the boy still running for Terry, but it made no difference. Snarf was staring daggers at Reggie, but when Josh called his name, he looked towards him, tail wagging. The bat crashed down on the dog, and the pitiful noise he made sent a shard of glass through Josh's guts. Walt and Patrick arrived in time to grab Terry under the arms and drag him away from the scene. Josh hit Reggie as hard as he could around the waist, dropping him to the concrete a 3rd time and sending the bat clinking across the asphalt with an angry wooden clitter. Reggie hit his head on the concrete, and as the wind oofed out of him, Josh punched him in the face. He saw Reggie's eyes glaze a little with the impact, his lips quivering in surprise as his head bounced off the pavement again. Josh got off him, picking up the bat as Reggie tried to get his bearings. Josh pointed the bat at Reggie, yelling at him to get out of here. He told him not to come near him, his friends, or his dog again. He said some of the adult words he knew, the cusses sounding high and whispery as he fought back tears. Reggie got up on an elbow, grinning at Josh as he seemed to dare him to do anything. When the other 3 boys came up behind him, though, Reggie realized that he might be in trouble if he decided to act in haste. He could take 1 kid, bat or no bat, but 4 kids would probably beat the tar out of him. So, he backed up on his hands before breaking into a run and fleeing for home. Josh would never feel bad about what he had done to Reggie, but looking back at that moment, he would feel a lot of shame. The shame came from letting his anger blind him to Snarf's pain, from letting his need to dispel Reggie separate him from his dog when he needed him most. It didn't matter, though. None of it really mattered. When Josh turned back around, it was already too late. Josh found himself glaring at Reggie's old house as he watched a pair of Transformers walk off with their chocolate. The house was occupied now, but it had been empty for quite some time after the family had moved away. That had happened later, months after he'd killed Snarf, and those months felt like an eternity at the time. Reggie's parents had refused to believe that their son had killed Snarf, and they seemed angrier that Josh and his friends had beaten up their son. When they threatened to call the police, after Reggie had come home with scrapes and bruises, Josh's mom had just dropped the whole thing. Reggie's parents are threatening to sue us for hospital costs, and I can't afford something like that, sweetie. I'm sorry about Snarf, but if we call the cops, we'll be in trouble as well. She told Josh this, and he had seethed in his 10-year-old heart. He saw a big blonde kid with a crew cut, dressed in a karate gi, and he almost didn't hand him anything. Reggie was still on his mind, and this kid could have passed for him once upon a time. His eyes, they didn't really have that evil gleam in them, though, and Josh smiled at him as he handed him some candy. The kid threw him a mock salute and rejoined the throng still parading up the street. Reggie had been bigger, meaner, but in the end, Reggie had not been braver. Josh had been inconsolable after the death of Snarf. He had pretended to be sick for a week, and his mother had just let him pretend in the wake of his sorrow. His grandma stayed with him, often just sitting with Josh while he wallowed in his misery. She never pushed him as he moped around the house, just letting him feel his hurt as she waited for it to pass. He mostly just lay on the couch and watched TV, not really paying attention, just liking the noise. As they sat there one afternoon, her arm draped around him, she told Josh something he would never forget. I know you miss your friend, but you can't let his death be the end of your life. You have to live it for both of you now. It's what he would have wanted. Josh looked up at her with big swimmy eyes. But I miss him. She smiled. I know you do, but it's almost Halloween, a time when they say the ghosts of our loved ones can walk the earth again. Maybe, just maybe, his love will be great enough to bring him back to you. That made him think. If ghosts and spirits could walk the earth on Halloween, then maybe Snarf could too. Josh spent the rest of the month in a little better mood, waiting for Halloween night so he could see if Snarf would come and visit. His mom had to work on Halloween, but Grandma was home with him and said that she could take him out trick-or-treating if he wanted. Josh didn't want to go out, though. He sat in his room and watched out the window, hoping to see Snarf as he ran up the front walk. When his friends came to see him, they were all costumed and looking for him to join their group. They begged him to trick-or-treat with them. They hadn't seen him in months. He hadn't come out to play since the baseball game, and they missed him. Each of them was dressed as a different Power Ranger, and Terry said his grandma had sent him a second costume if Josh wanted to use it. Josh had a feeling that Terry had bought it in case he decided to come out with them, and though touched, Josh still didn't want to go. He might miss Snarf, and he wanted to see him if he came back. Once again, Grandma had the answer. I'll keep an eye out for him, and I'll tell him to stay if he comes to see you while you're gone. Josh was hesitant, but after some coaxing, he put on the costume and left with his group of friends. They had made him the Blue Ranger, his favorite Power Ranger, and as they set out into the night, he felt a little better. Josh had missed his friends over the past few weeks, but after what had happened, he just couldn't bring himself to see them. Going out with him now made him feel a lot better, and they spent a few blissful hours filling their sacks with candy. It would have been a perfect Halloween if Reggie hadn't come. Josh started noticing lights going out in the cul-de-sac as it ticked closer to 10. The kids who were present were becoming older, the little kids already turning in, and he furrowed his brow as Snarf still hadn't appeared. He felt like he had on that first Halloween after Snarf's death, looking for him as he'd walked the streets, hoping to catch a glimpse of him. Josh heard a bark and snapped his head to the side expectantly. He frowned, though, when he saw it was just a lab in a bee costume. Its owner came hurrying after him, followed by a football player heading for the next house. A pair of ninjas wandered up next, and Josh sighed as he dug them out some candy. Surely he wouldn't stand him up. He hadn't stood him up that night, so why start now? It was almost 10 by the time the lights started going out on that long-ago Halloween. The street began to empty, and Josh's bag was beginning to get heavy. He and his friends had bulging sacks of candy, and they were sitting on the sidewalk and trading. Josh had started out looking for Snarf, glancing around as they walked against the tide of excited children. In those 2 hours, he had gotten a reprieve from his sadness, but as the night wound down, the old feelings were starting to fester again. He told his friends that he had to get home, and Josh started looking for him again as he moved through the thinning group of trick-or-treaters. He wanted to get home so he could see if Snarf had come back, which was probably why he missed Reggie. When the egg hit him in the side of the head, Josh staggered under the impact. His ear rang, and he thought he was bleeding when his gloved hand came away wet. One look told him it was just egg yolk, though. He looked across the street and saw Reggie grinning at him from under a lamppost. He wasn't in costume, dressed in his baseball shorts and a tank top, but he did have a silver bat in his hand, tossing an egg up and catching it in his other as he smiled. Josh froze when he saw that he was staring at him, realizing how vulnerable he was out here alone with his house 3 street lights away. "Been waiting for you to come out. We got unfinished business, Four Eyes. I think I owe you the same sort of beating I gave your stupid dog," he chuckled, swinging the bat experimentally. Josh stepped off the curve towards him, angry at what he had said, but thought better of it immediately. That metal bat could cave his skull in, and Reggie was pretty good at swinging bats. He glanced towards his house instead. 3 streetlights didn't seem so far, and Josh thought he could probably run faster than Reggie if it came to it. It seemed it was either run or sit here and get killed by this psycho. The choice seemed pretty obvious. He made the first light, easily outstriping Reggie, but Josh heard him getting closer as he moved under the second light. Reggie slapped the light pole with the bat as he went by, and it made a hollow thunk sound as it connected. Josh started to panic when he heard it. What if he caught him? What if he killed him? Would he die in the street like Snarf had? Josh wished that Snarf was here as his tears streamed down his face. He would have protected him. Snarf would have stopped Reggie from hurting him. If Josh hadn't distracted him that day, maybe Snarf would be here to help him. His house was in sight when the second egg cracked him in the back of the head. He stumbled as the egg connected. Josh had forgotten about the eggs. Though it hadn't been thrown very hard, it surprised him. Josh staggered into the fence that separated his yard from the neighbor's and crashed against it with a loud thunk. His head connected with the boards as he fell, and his head swam a little as the cheap plastic mask broke into pieces. Josh was reaching out in slow motion, moving his hands and legs like someone wading through mud. He rolled onto his butt as he prepared to take off again, but it was too late. Reggie loomed over him, the streetlight gleaming off his bat. "Looks like I caught you, Four Eyes," Reggie said, raising the bat. "Say hi to your dog for me when you see him." Josh pushed up against the fence, hoping it would fall backwards, knowing it wasn't going anywhere. Reggie raised the bat high, the metal twinkling as the light made galaxies of starbursts. Josh closed his eyes, preparing for the blow that would end his life prematurely. When the growl split the night, though, he opened his eyes and looked between Reggie's splayed legs. Reggie had turned his head to look at the shadowy crevice between the house and the fence that now stopped Josh from escaping. Between the structures stood a snarling, red-eyed creature that seemed to fill the space with its shadowy mass. Reggie took a sidelong step away from Josh, the beast snarling hugely as it took a single thunderous step towards him. Josh felt his breath hitch as Reggie stepped into the street, and the looming thing lowered its head and rumbled. Josh's brain couldn't fathom it. This nightmare creature had appeared in his neighborhood out of nowhere, and was now seconds away from ending both him and his bully. When it loosed that single ear-splitting snarl, Josh put his head between his knees and pushed his palms against his ears. He sat in the darkness, screaming against his legs as he prepared to be devoured. Josh had assumed that he would die that night after running from the hulking brute, but never like this. When the warm tongue slid over his hair, he cracked the back of his head against the fence, trying to escape again. Then he opened his eyes, gasping like a trapped animal, to find Snarf's panting, grinning face. Reggie was gone, Bat lying in the street, and Josh wrapped his arms around his lost friend. He laughed as Snarf licked his cheek. He pressed his face against the dog's familiar short fur, and Josh's sadness melted away as Snarf's doggy tongue bombarded him. That was how his mom had found him, laughing with his back against the fence as her headlights dissipated the ghostly dog licking him as he'd done so many times before. Snarf had come back and visited him on Halloween night every year since. His mother didn't come right out and say it at first. She was upset about his injuries, but she told Josh later that she had seen Snarf for a few seconds before her headlights hit him. After he told her what had happened with Reggie, she called the police. She gave them the bat, told them how Reggie had been a problem this summer, and started a process of having a restraining order placed against him. She was tired of being bullied by Reggie's parents, as tired as Josh was of being bullied by Reggie. Reggie's family moved shortly before the order was finalized. Josh never saw him again, and was happier for it. Josh watched his mother walk up the front lawn now, Lily in her arms as she sleepily held onto her sack of candy. She was stumbling on the way back. "I think we're going to have some cocoa if you'd like to join us." "Give me a few more minutes, Mom. I think he's just running late this year." Mom smiled. "Take all the time you need, dear." She walked inside, leaving him on the stoop. The street was emptying, only a few stragglers heading for home, and Josh glanced around furtively. Where was Snarf? Had he forgotten about his old friend? 20 years was a long time to visit someone who wasn't a little boy anymore. Maybe he had... Josh dropped the bowl of candy when that ghostly cold nose prodded his hand. He looked down to find Snarf, tail wagging, as he smiled up at him from the front lawn of the house he had loved so much. Josh wrapped his arms around him, and it felt like coming home again.
And just like that, our stories are at an end. But don't worry, I'm sure we'll have many more days of cozy horror ahead of us, as I sit out here and try not to get a heat stroke. But until then, this is Dr. Plague, wishing you a wonderful day and a spooky evening.